Hey, welcome. This presentation is entitled The History of Native Math and Science, and today I'll be your guest lecturer. My name is Dr. Kent Blansett. I'm the Langston Hughes Associate Professor of Indigenous Studies and History at the University of Kansas. I come from 5 tribes, so I'm Cherokee Creek, Choctaw, Shawnee, and Potawatomi descendant. I come from 3 family lines, that of the Blanket, Panther, and of course the quintessential Indian name, Smith, is also in my family line. And today I'm going to be talking about something that's very near and dear to my heart, which you probably never had a course on the history of Native math and science before. And I'm hopeful that this is a course that could act, or at least a lecture that could act as something that might influence you to at least study this subject matter in more depth. And hopefully, maybe, just maybe, you might become a practitioner or a teacher of Native math and science in the near future. So to begin with, I'd like to go into how I got into this topic, because it is a very unusual topic. Nobody else is really teaching this class in the rest of the country. So my story goes back to my undergraduate. I did my undergraduate degree at the University of Missouri in Columbia. And on the weekends, I decided to work for a non-for-profit corporation called Visible Horizons. And so I would drive all the way to Kansas City, and I would tutor inner city Native kids in this organization as a college student. And one of the students that I was tutoring, who was Seminole, looked up at me one day while we were working on algebra, and he said, why do we need to do this? Why do I even need math? It's like, we as Native people, we didn't have math. Why do I even need to do this? And so I was shocked. I was in absolute awe, and I said to myself, okay, you know what, Jason, what we're going to do is I'm going to prove to you by the end of the year that we not only had Native math and science, but it was integral to everything that we did. And so I set out that entire semester working on researching our Native math systems, and also that then kind of influenced me to kind of begin to see that as the language of science in which this presentation is derived. From there, I went ahead and was an intern one summer at the Office of Indian Education Programs in the Bureau of Indian Affairs, and I got a chance to, at that point in time, see a little bit of the curriculum that's being taught in a lot of the contract, grant, and day schools in reservation communities across the country. And a lot of that curriculum really kind of didn't sit well with me, because when I started reading the math curriculum, there was such things as, oh, well, with a word problem and doing mathematics, what we'll do to relate to Native students is we'll take out Johnny has 5 apples, you subtract 3 apples, how many does Johnny have? And we'll subtract the apple out of this, and we'll add horses, because we know how Native peoples feel about horses, and this will be more culturally relevant. It still wasn't addressing the fact that we have long-standing Native mathematical principles and systems. And of course, that was being ignored, at least in that standardized curriculum across the country. Where I really kind of sunk my teeth into this subject matter the most is I did eventually a master's and a PhD at University of New Mexico, and I taught a course, the first ever course in the history of Native math and science at the University of New Mexico. And I got bit by the teaching bug, and I really enjoyed doing it. I had about 20 students enrolled in that course, and it also led me to want to go on and get my PhD and teach history. From there, I also had the chance in teaching that course to get recognized and invited by NASA for a special conference in Farmington, which NASA at this point in time, in the latter part of the 1990s, was interested in still looking at global warming. And what they were looking at is they were looking at how Native peoples and our ancient ancestors adapted to extreme conditions and extreme temperatures, and still had cities that we created throughout the American Southwest, and how we were able to adapt and thrive within such an environment. So I gave a presentation on Native math, and I remember telling a story about counting, which is a story I love telling to my students. And one of the stories originated from a Native nation in Alaska. And it's a story about these 2 hunters, and they go out and they're hunting, and they're trying to decide, who's the best hunter out of the both of us. And so they scratch their heads for a little bit, and they come up with a solution. They come up with a plan. And the plan's going to be that to figure out who the best hunter in the village is it's based on what you kill, your first kill. So they go out and they said, whatever you first kill, what we're going to do is we're going to count the number of hairs on that animal. And whoever has the most fur, obviously, is going to basically be the best hunter because you're going to keep the people warmer longer. So they go out and they do just that. They go and they look for their animals. Hunter one gets, his deer. At least hunter number two goes out and gets a big elk. And they sit down and they start counting. They start plucking and they're counting the furs and they're going into the tens, into the hundreds, into the thousands. And pretty soon the seconds fly by, the days fly by. All of a sudden, out of those days that fly by, they're just still counting. They're obsessed with who's going to be the best hunter. The problem is they forget to eat. The problem is they forget to drink water. And in their absolute obsession, they die from this obsession of trying to count. And it was said for many years, at least for anthropologists, that for Alaska Native peoples, they couldn't count above 1,000 because it was absolutely frivolous. It would mean your death to be counting into those larger numbers. We know that this is absolutely not true, but counting is absolutely integral to everything that we've done in our communities, all the way from ancient times into our present day. Another story was, and I told this story at that NASA conference, and all of a sudden we had governors and lieutenant governors from the Pueblo raising their hands, offering up stories of their own of how counting applies even into their own, at least traditions, and the meanings of those numbers within the tradition, which we're going to get into at quite some depth. Now, another case of where I use this story in the sense of, or this research, was I gave a presentation to a lot of students in the tribes program at UNM. And in one of those presentations, I gave a statistic. And that statistic is that the Crow agency are about 80% fluent in their language. So they have one of the largest fluencies of any Native nation in North America. Now, the issue is that I raised is that despite having 80% fluency, very few Crow can count above 20 in their own language. Now, what's fascinating about this is I had a Crow student that was sitting there and all of a sudden their hand jumped right up. And what it is they wanted to challenge that notion. And they said, you're wrong, professor. Actually, I can count well above 20 in my language. So I asked her, I was like, go ahead and count for me. And so she started off and she started in her language and she started counting and everything was great. And she was smiling like, I've just proved you wrong. I said, okay, now I want you to translate those numbers in the language, right? And so she began translating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And I said, you know what? That's great, but you're not speaking Crow. You're immediately counting in English and translating it into Crow. And without the meaning of those numbers, we lose the vitality of our mathematical system. To give you another example of that and why language matters and Indigenous language matters, Floyd Solomon, who is Laguna Pueblo, I once took a class with him and he was talking about going back and relearning his traditional language. And when he learned his language, he went back to go fishing with an elder at Laguna Pueblo. And that elder took him out fishing and he began to say, okay, let me test you on, your knowledge of the Laguna language. And he began asking him questions like, hey, name this rock over here. And he was like, okay, I can think of the Laguna word. And he uses the Laguna word to describe rock, and he describes tree, and he describes creek, and he describes all these different objects that the elder's pointing to. And eventually, after 10 or 15 of them, the elder says, okay, that's very good, but you're still not speaking Laguna. And Floyd scratched his head. He's like, what? I don't understand. And the elder said, well, if you wanted to speak Laguna properly, you would tell me how you're related to that tree. You would tell me how you're related to that rock, how you're related to that stream. And then you would be speaking in Laguna. In other words, you can't remove the person from the language itself. You can't remove also the person from the mathematical system.